April 3rd, I believe. So I know they say spring is here, but I'm still seeing snow, and I know Newfoundland is not having a good time of it today with all the snow they're receiving. But in our minds, let's have it be spring, shall we? So today we're going to talk about negotiation, and something I suspect that all of you have to do in one form or another. And so I want to talk about some strategies for negotiating and some of the things that you really should be thinking about when it comes to negotiating and when it comes to figuring out what are all the tactics and what are all the strategies and what are all of the things that you need to be thinking about to successfully negotiate. Now, negotiation is considered an art. It's not an art form that all of us have mastered or even comfortable with, for that matter. And so I just wanted to give you a few tips and tools to think about negotiating, and we're really going to be focused on in the workplace. So it could be with a colleague, it could be with a customer or client, it could be with a broker, it could be with an underwriter. So in a work setting, that's really what I want to focus on for everybody. So that's what we're going to go through this morning. As always, I encourage questions. Please feel free to jump in with any questions that you might have. Happy to answer. You can also use the chat forum on the GoToMeeting app to ask questions as well. Okay, so first of all, we need to figure out what is negotiation. What does that even mean? What are we referring to when we say negotiating? And so the idea of negotiating, the concept, if you will, is when two or more people with different views come together to try to reach an agreement on an issue or a topic. And the key for me in this statement is come together. So the idea is that, negotiating doesn't necessarily have to be a contentious situation. It really is coming together and bringing together two different and varying perspectives to try to reach agreement. So I'll come back to that. So what are the components of negotiating? And how do we typically approach negotiating? Well, as you can see by the slide, a lot of us think of it as an adversarial situation. There's us and there's them. And if you enter into a discussion, negotiation with that mindset, your chances of success are significantly lowered because you've positioned yourselves as polar opposites. And where the idea is to meet somewhere where everybody's happy. That is really the core idea around negotiation. And so are you thinking of it as what is the most that I can get out of this, and I need to persuade them that what I want is better? And you may very well be able to do that, but have you really won is the question. And so where two parties can walk away feeling as though they were both heard, they both got something out of the negotiation, and even perhaps the relationship has been strengthened in some way or another. So there's a lot of variables to really good negotiation beyond just what they want and what you want. And I really want to walk through some of those components and some of the things that I'll ask you to think about. So what do you want to achieve? And this is my favorite statement about negotiation. It really is about getting the best possible deal in the best possible way. And so that last part of that sentence, the best possible way, is a part that we often forget about. How are we getting to our accomplishment? How are we getting to the win? And as you can see by this graph, your happiness and their happiness obviously is really what's optimal. It's really what you're trying to get to. So that actually pulls on some interesting skills that you'll have to tap into in order to consider both their happiness and my happiness. But before I get into that, let's think about what are the components of really good negotiating. So first of all, let's think about power and position. So when I say position and power, I don't necessarily mean, who's the strongest, who's the boss necessarily. But think about positioning from all of its aspects. So seating, for instance. When you walk into a room, who has the power position? So it's as much as perspective as it is in actual power. So when you're going into a scenario where it's your boss and you having to negotiate something, the power dynamic is clear there. But what if it's another colleague? And that colleague perceives you as perhaps because you're the one with the expertise, for instance, in a particular area, then the power balance moves in your favor. So having some awareness of that, so if the power balance is in your favor, what do you need to do to actually make the other person feel comfortable? Now, I know that seems contrary to negotiating, but a win-win, one of the components of that is having the other person feel as though they're having a fair say and a fair shot in this discussion. So you really do want to be aware of what the power dynamics are, whether it's seating, positioning, level, or what have you. You want to think about that, and then you also want to consider how might that power dynamic be perceived by the other individual or the other group of individuals. So that's an interesting thought when it comes to negotiating for you to consider that's beyond sort of the I want this and they want that. The second key is around perspective. So what is the other person's or other group's position? What are some of the variables that are important for them? And it would be really smart if you're going into negotiations to really think about what are the other party's needs? What is going to matter to the other party? I call it understanding someone's currency. So what's going to matter to a group? So whether it's, I've dealt with organizations that are unionized, for instance, and negotiating with unions, part of the perspective and the empathy is that the person you're dealing with feels the weight of negotiating for a group of people. And having some empathy around that and even stating it, I understand you're in a challenging position, you're speaking for a large group, and I can imagine the weight of that for you. Just that statement can be very disarming. And it also can help with the balance piece as well, if you employ some of that perspective and empathy throughout a negotiation discussion. And then lastly, it's the problem. And I like to flip that to solution. So you want to go into negotiations solution-based thinking. How do we make this right? How do we make it better? How do we both get what we want? What are the things that need to come into play in order for that to happen? So really thinking through, okay, we understand and we frame the problem. So let's work on solutions. Another theory that I wrap around this sometimes is, my belief in leadership is around, be hard on the issues and easy on the people. And so if you apply that somewhat to this, you're never talking about, you're never directly talking about people in terms of emotion or impact. You're talking about the problem. So you really want to be careful that you're not singling out individuals or blaming individuals, and you're really identifying what the problems are and therefore getting yourself to solutions. Okay. So let's talk about some of the factors for success for negotiating. So first and foremost, legitimacy for your case. So if someone comes to me, let's just say one of my teammates, and says, I want a 50% raise because I feel I deserve it, and they brought me ideas around, maybe projects that they've really scored well on, anything that would make me feel as though I even want to enter into a negotiation with them. And frankly, a 50% raise is unheard of. That's significant. So the legitimacy of the case, and maybe this is a poor performer, and they just don't have any self-awareness, or maybe I haven't done a good job telling them that, but whatever the reason, you need to come to the table with something legitimate. So you really need to ask yourself before you even enter into negotiations, is this something that will be perceived by the other side as legitimate and real, and something that they can wrap themselves around in terms of a conversation? If you think that you might be out in left field, do a self-check. Ask yourself, ask colleagues, do a check with someone else before you walk into a situation and realize, okay, this is, I've wasted my time. The next factor is your confidence in presenting it, and it really, that connects to the legitimacy. If you believe in the legitimacy of your case, that in itself will give you some confidence in how you present it. But confidence comes from knowing your facts. You've done your research. You looked at maybe past cases or past situations. Maybe you've got a customer that wants something that is not, within the realm of reality in terms of maybe something they're looking for in services from you. And so if it's not something that's typically offered, you need to be confident in stating, you know what, in our field, that's not typically done, but let's think of something else that might be helpful for you. And then try to move the conversation on to something that is within the realm of reality. But your confidence in understanding that and knowing, whether it's knowing guidelines, protocol, policy, understanding all of that, to back up what it is that you're negotiating for. I think of a time when employees will have negotiated salary, which is probably a very common negotiating item. Understanding what the trend is maybe for people who've been in that role before, or similar roles in the organization, bringing data like that to the conversation is helpful. And it should also help you be very confident in your presentation. The next point is courtesy to the other party. I've seen situations where even when someone is right, they're negotiating, and let's just go back to salary for a second. Even if they're negotiating in a way or have facts that are indisputable, the way that they negotiate tears down the negotiating success. So I very well may have great facts, and I very well may be justified in asking for a raise. However, the way that I'm approaching it with my boss, if I'm being aggressive, if I have sort of a know-it-all kind of attitude, that picks away at your chances of success because that pushes off the other party. So being courteous, understanding their perspective, listening, which we all know how important that is, making sure the other party feels heard, and responding to that in a way that is clear, concise, and respectful. Adaptation to the other party's style. Now, this is interesting. So think about some people you may know that have a very sort of casual approach to things. They're great at what they do, but maybe their approach is just kind of casual and relaxed. And if you have to go in negotiations with someone like this, and you're very firm, very rigid, very, not terribly flexible, those are two styles that are likely going to come up against each other. So if you know the group or person that you're about to walk into negotiations with, think about how they typically approach just day-to-day work. If this is information you have, or if you've had any kind of interaction with this group or person. So think about how they typically approach things. And think about how you might adapt your style to fit that, not because you're conceding, not because you're giving in, but so that all parties are balanced in terms of how the communication happens. It's actually a very widely used strategy in negotiation, is adapting style to the party. Rapport is something that sometimes can be challenging to build when you're negotiating. So thinking about, how do I create rapport with the other person, or do I currently already have rapport, and that's something I want to maintain. So this is something, again, you want to think through. Is this a potentially contentious topic that I'm negotiating over? And is the relationship at risk? And if so, you really want to think through, then what are the strategies that I need to use to ensure that that rapport and that relationship stay intact? You're not always going to be able to do that, but thinking it through is the first step. So being mindful of what are the dynamics of the relationship. If it's a customer or client, which is typically when we might find ourselves in negotiations, what will be the win in terms of the topic I'm negotiating, and what will be the win for the relationship? And those two components need to be thought through before you walk into any sort of negotiation. Incentives and trade-offs. So think about, what are you prepared to restructure? What are you prepared to give in order to get what you want? And I've talked to clients in the past and said, look, you may make a list of the things that you're willing to give on. So for instance, if I'm negotiating with one of my team around salary, and I'm flexible around vacation, but I've got a budget that I have to maintain, and so salaries, I don't have as much flexibility there, then I may throw in, listen, what if we bumped your vacation by, an extra 2%, maybe that's a lot, 1% per month accumulatively. Is that something that you would consider in lieu of however many percentage points in salary? Would you think about that? Or maybe I might say, okay, we're not going to be able to get where we want in terms of salary, but what if you took on extra projects, and if we saw that extra, work and that extra payoff for the business, that could be incentive that we could negotiate around salary. So just trying to be open and being creative around ways to get to your happiness and their happiness. So really thinking creatively about that, and that also shows a willingness to try to get there, which buys you goodwill with the other party. And then research the bigger picture. So you want to be careful that you're not negotiating in a bubble. So think about, what are the broader implications? So one of the things, and I keep going back to salary because it's an easy thing to talk about in terms of negotiation, but what if I did grant that, 8% salary increase? And I hadn't really thought about the impact on the business. So what about other departments in the business that now I've set a precedent for? So I really want to be careful that, I'm not setting a precedent that now impacts other parts of the business. So I need to understand the big picture. So as an organization, historically, what have we done? What have been, the trends within the organization? So as a leader, as a boss, I need to make sure that I understand all of those big picture components before I walk into negotiations. I have responsibility for the business as a whole, and I also am responsible to this employee and all the other employees within the business line. So I really need to think through what's the impact for the individual, what's the impact for the team, and what's the impact for the business. So when you're entering into negotiations, regardless of what side you're negotiating from, try to do your homework. What's the history with the client? What's been done before? What's been done for other clients? So just a few things to be thinking about. So let's talk about some steps. So what are the steps in negotiating? And, the more contentious this potential negotiation is, the more you're probably going to want to stick to these steps. So let's talk about the first one, establishing your objectives. What do you want to accomplish in this discussion? What are your very clear and concise objectives? And you should be able to name that very succinctly. So if I want to go into a negotiation with an employee around negotiating, I understand what they want. My objective is to ensure that the employee feels as though they are fairly compensated, and it is within the purview of the business, so within the budget of the business, that I can consider an increased salary. So my objectives are specific. I want them to feel fairly compensated, and I want to do that within the budget that I have to work with. So those are my two objectives. The other person's objective might be, well, I want to make as much money, I want to get as much money as I want out of them. And I'm sort of taking a negative tactic here just so that we can sort of use this as a bit of a case study. So getting as much as I want out of them is not a clear and concise objective. I would say, if I were coaching that person, well, name that. What is that exactly? So is it 50%? Is it 20%? Is it 2%? What is that? Well, come to find out, maybe, they want more money, but they also want more time to themselves. Oh. Folks, can we just make sure everybody's on mute, please? I've got some interesting background music going on. Hello? Okay. Oh? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can. And the
No,
music.
we can.
I can, and the music.
We can hear the music too, but
That is bizarre. Okay.
Oh, there goes the hold music.
Well, I don't know who fixed it, but thank you, whoever you are. Appreciate it. That was strange.
Sorry about
Okay.
that. I had to take another call.
Oh my gosh, that's okay. That's okay. You just woke me up. So let's get back to the steps. So talking about your objectives, be clear on what your objectives are. So really try to quantify and qualify what those objectives are for you, and really think through what is your baseline in terms of objectives. If you have a list of 8 things, then I would suggest you think about what are the top 3 things that you really want to achieve. And so prioritize your objectives if you have many. And most negotiations, you really having 8 things that you want to negotiate, you're probably going to want to break that up into several discussions. So think about what you want to focus on, and then maybe come around to others later on, but focus on those core objectives first. The other thing that you want to do is, so if you establish your objectives, you also want to establish the other person's objectives. So you really want to understand, again, what's their currency, right? What matters to them. Because if you're not talking their language in any way, shape, or form, again, if there's a misalignment in the communication, then you may not get to where you want to be in terms of discussion and landing on some really good solutions. So establish your objectives, put those on the table. Establish the other party's objectives, make sure they're on the table, and make sure that you both agree to understanding of each other's objectives. If there's something that you don't understand about the other person's objectives, go back and clarify. Make sure you understand. So you know what they want, you know what you want. Done. The next is to frame the negotiation as a joint search. So a joint search for solutions. So you want to try to step away from that adversarial, their side, my side sort of language and positioning. What you really want to do is help each other get to a solution that satisfies both. So Amy, we'll use, her name is Amy. Amy wants a raise. I want to make sure Amy is fairly compensated within the parameters of the budget that I have to work with. I may not talk about within the parameters of the budget. That might not be a stated objective. But if I understand for myself what my parameters are, I may say something like, you know, Amy, I absolutely want to make sure that you feel that you're comped in a way that feels good to you and also is within my ability to do as a leader. So let's talk through, you know, what that number looks like to you and then go from there. So it's not, I can't give you X because it's never been done before. It's starting with what are her objectives and what are my objectives, and where do we have agreement? Where do we have alignment? You don't have to negotiate the things you agree on. So figuring out, yes, we both want Amy to feel fairly compensated. Can we both agree on that? Absolutely. What the number is what we're going to negotiate. So frame it up as a joint search for a solution. You may have to dig a little to figure out what that like language is. And as I already said, number 4, identify areas of agreement. So if we both want her to feel comped, great, let's put that aside. So now all we have to do is figure out what the numbers look like. But where you do have agreement, and you know, I'm using a very simple, you know, example here. And a lot of the areas that a lot of you deal with have much more complexity to it in terms of policies and the like. And so what are the things, if you're negotiating, what are the components that we're good with, that we both agree on? Great. So try to get the quick wins first and then put those aside. You may have to come back to them, which is fine, but the quick wins is what's going to help you establish rapport early on, what's going to have you establish a team-like attitude to getting to a solution. So if you do that quickly and do that first, that will really help pave the way for the parts of the discussion that might be a little more contentious. Okay. So the next part is to troubleshoot the areas that you do have disagreement. So think about alternatives, and I always suggest that you walk through what would happen if the negotiation went well and what would happen if the negotiation didn't go well. What are the possibilities if it doesn't go well? Try to think about that well before you even are in the room with the individual or speaking with the individual. So then you can have alternatives at your fingertips. So think about the different components of a deal, policy, contract, discussion, whatever it is, and what are the alternatives? if you have an understanding of what they want, what else could that look like? And if you think about that prior to the discussion, that puts you in really good positioning to have a fruitful conversation. Lastly, once you are able to have discussion around what you're not so close together on, and if there is some back and forth in terms of negotiating the pieces, and then you finally get to a place where there's enough of an agreement that we can say, okay, I think we've got something here. Summarize everything. Go through it again. Make sure, yes, this is where we both landed. Make sure you hear the other person accept the fact that, yes, I agree to all of this, and you state the same. And then, of course, depending on what it is, you're going to want to get it in writing. Most things in business we're going to want to have in writing. And writing may not mean, maybe it's a discussion with someone around behavior and you're negotiating, their behavior within the workplace. What would help you do less of this? How can I support you in that? This is all negotiating. And so if they agree on something, that's not necessarily something you put in a contract, but you can summarize your discussion in an email. And then that constitutes, putting it in writing, if you will. But always following up with something that you can reference back to will always be helpful to you. So here's something that is in most negotiation training. Two things that we learn, and many of you may have heard of this, the BATNA and the WHATNA. So your BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Very standard terminology in negotiating. So the BATNA is something, again, that you can think about. So if I can't come to agreement on what I understand they want and what I know that I want, what's the best alternative to that? Again, something you want to think about before you go in. So if Amy's negotiating a 50% pay raise and I'm really at 2%, I could simply say, here's your 2%, that's it. Is that going to be what's best for the relationship? Probably not. So maybe I say, you want 50%? That is well beyond what I'm capable of offering. You feel that what I'm offering you at 2% is way below what you're prepared to accept. So what's the best alternative to this? A, maybe I come up and she comes down. B, maybe we go away and think about other alternatives. You don't have to accomplish an agreement in every discussion. Sometimes going away is the best thing, particularly if you've come to a stalemate. So going away and thinking about alternatives, A, keeps the dialogue going. B, you're still engaged in the discussion, so the person doesn't necessarily feel, even though they didn't get what they want, that you're still engaged and you're still involved and you still want to find a solution, and that can buy you goodwill. So as the question states, what else would work? So maybe it's not the pay raise. Maybe it's, she's been wanting more progression in her career. Maybe we put her on a training plan that helps to accomplish that. Maybe we look at different alternatives. But a good negotiator understands their BATNA and their WHATNA before they go into the room. If I can't get what I want, what's the next best thing? And sometimes the BATNA for you is something that, ideally this is what I want. My BATNA is, I'll, land on a slightly higher salary number. Maybe that's my BATNA. And maybe that's the only thing I'm willing to move on. So you have to decide. Maybe you have a second BATNA as well. So figuring out what that BATNA is a really important step as you enter. So this is a planning step. As you enter negotiations, you want to have thought through what your BATNA is. Now, the WHATNA is a really interesting tool for you to use in negotiation. What's the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement? So if we can't come together, what's the worst that could happen? So if Amy wants 50% and I want 2%, and I'm not going to budge and Amy's not going to budge, maybe Amy quits. So if I'm in negotiations with Amy, I'd ask that question. So Amy, if we can't come together, what's the worst that could possibly happen here? She may say, well, you know, I go back to work, I take the 2%, but I'm disgruntled and disengaged. Maybe that's her worst alternative. So I'd even take it a step further. Maybe she walks away from the table and quits. So what I perceive as the worst alternative and what Amy perceives as the worst alternative may be two different things. Sometimes when you're stuck, it's good to ask that question within the negotiation. If we can't come together, what's the worst thing that could happen? Because you want to use that as a motivation for that not to happen. Sometimes it's helpful to talk about worst case scenario so that you don't get there and that you both put on the table, okay, that's not something that I want. How do you feel about it? Maybe Amy says, look, that's not what I want either. That's not where I saw this conversation going. Great. So we can agree that we don't want the worst case scenario. So there's got to be something that we can do in between. It also sometimes can be a view to you into that person's thinking to ask that question. Right? So she very quickly says, look, if we can't negotiate, I'm gone. Well, then you know where Amy is. She's given you some insight into her thinking. So your BATNA and your WHATNA are two things that you want to be armed with when you think about negotiating. So I've got some tips. So aim high, and I think everybody knows this, but aim high to start. It's easier to lose ground than to gain ground. So, you know, Amy's maybe shooting high with 50%, but I may come up to 5. 50 is kind of a crazy number when I think about it, but, you know, that's a good example of where, to me, there's no legitimacy in the ask. So that's a perspective I have. Yes, concede where you can, but don't give it up too easily. So you want to give concessions because, again, it shows goodwill, it shows flexibility, and you're really trying to problem solve as opposed to just beat the other side down. But don't just give in to what is wanted, what is being asked for. So give concessions, but just only as required. Now, I mentioned earlier that there will be some, you know, a lot of the things that you folks will be engaged in terms of negotiation will be much more complex than the example that I've been using. So if you have complex deals, break them down into pieces. So if it's, you know, I challenge you to even come up with an example for your industry, but if you're thinking about negotiating a policy and there are multiple components of it where there's disagreement, then break each of those components down and negotiate each of those components separately. Don't try to necessarily negotiate everything all in one discussion or one conversation. Break it down and say, okay, today I want to focus on this aspect of the policy. And let's just try to get to agreement, then we'll deal with B and C. Okay, so finally, and I really think that this is a helpful tool, make proposals with open questions. So instead of saying, well, I'm prepared to do this, ask the question, So what will happen if we did this? What would happen if I gave you 3% and put you in the leadership training program? What would happen if that were the case? What if we did that? Or what will be the result if I gave you 3% and offered you more vacation? So ask the question as opposed to this really stiff sort of negotiating style, which in some situations works, but typically when we're dealing with people, more conversational and more, questions that ask for input and engagement will likely get you further. So if you really find yourself in a position where you're stuck, and that happens, that's okay, that happens. But then you need to ask the question, what would need to happen to get you to move on this component? What would have to happen in order for you to give up 50%? What would you need to see happen? And then push it over to the other person. What that does is helps to create the flexibility. That question helps to get the other person unstuck and think about alternatives. And if you can create as many alternatives as you can for yourself and for the other party, those are the tools that will get you to a win-win. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about in terms of negotiation and maybe a few tools that you'll be able to take away and use as you're having negotiation discussions with clients, brokers, peers, your boss, whomever. Now, we will be having a second part to this where I will be doing a deeper dive, and I'll have to come up with some more relevant examples. I think that will be helpful, but we'll get a little bit deeper into this and really talk about more of the components of negotiating and more of the technical pieces around negotiating. So any questions before we jump off? Well, hearing none, I thank everybody for your undivided attention, and we'll see you. I'm not sure what the next date is, but I know that an email will come out confirming that, and we'll definitely see you April 10th. Thanks, Tanya. Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a